Okay, welcome back everyone. In this video, I'm going to give you a broad introduction to entrepreneurship. So we'll talk about how we define entrepreneurship, all the different forms that entrepreneurship can take, and start to tackle the question of who is an entrepreneur. Then in video 3, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to some of the core concepts that we'll be delving into in more detail later in the module, like effectuation, the test and learn approach, design thinking, and the liability of newness. All right, let's start at the beginning. There are lots of definitions out there for what entrepreneurship is. You probably have your own definition of what entrepreneurship is. So here's one definition that I like. Entrepreneurship as a field seeks to understand how opportunities to create something new arise and are discovered or created by specific individuals who then use various means to exploit or develop them, producing a wide range of effects. Now, stick with me because I know that definition sounds very academic. And to be honest, the exact definition that we want to use of what entrepreneurship is doesn't really matter that much. And we can debate, for example, how new something has to be included in this definition. But that's more like something academics like to sit around and do. And it isn't necessarily that useful to us here. What I like about this definition, what I want you to take away from that definition, is that it signals that we'll be talking about the effects and objectives of entrepreneurship as varied. What do I mean by that? Of course, ventures can be profit motivated, like the ones that probably typically come into your mind when you think of entrepreneurship, like Uber, or if you want a more local example, like Jobber, which is an entrepreneurial venture that provides a service of scheduling and billing software for small businesses that was founded right here in Edmonton. But entrepreneurship can also have primarily social aims. I'll give you another couple of examples. There's an Alberta-based social enterprise called Leftovers, which tries to divert food waste from waste streams. Or another Edmonton-based social enterprise called Earthwater, which sells water bottles now in aluminum cans in order to raise money to fund school meals around the world through the World Food Program. This idea is called social entrepreneurship. Or entrepreneurship can be really personal, like small businesses that are very innovative in their own right, but quite small, like something that might find on Etsy or some other platform like that. So one question that you might be asking at this point is, does it have to involve the start of a new venture to be considered entrepreneurship? And the answer to that is no, not really. Opportunities to create new sources of value, which is at the heart of what entrepreneurship is, can even occur within existing organizations. That's sometimes called intrapreneurship, but it's really the same idea. And it can be supported through all of the same tools that we're going to talk about in this module. But generally speaking, there are two primary forms of entrepreneurship. On the one hand, you have small and medium enterprises, sometimes referred to as SMEs. And on the other hand, as you can see through the graphic that you'll see on the screen, we have something called innovation-driven entrepreneurship, where these entrepreneurial ventures are really focused on innovation and profitability and growth. So what are the primary distinctions between these two? SMEs are often more focused on addressing local and regional markets, whereas innovation-driven entrepreneurship is often more focused on global markets. When we talk about innovation, this is not necessarily something that SMEs are often really focused on, which is of course not the case with innovation-driven entrepreneurship, as the name would suggest. With innovation-driven entrepreneurship, the company is generally based on some sort of technological or business process or business model innovation, and really thinking about deriving their competitive advantage based on this innovation. And we often implicitly favor innovation-driven entrepreneurship, but let's not forget that small and medium enterprises really have their benefits as well. They're often really good, for example, at providing non-tradable jobs, because these are jobs that generally need to be performed locally. So if you think about a restaurant, a local grocery store, a dry cleaner, some service industries, these are all businesses that can't be outsourced. Versus innovation-driven entrepreneurship typically is generally at the more macroeconomic level. These jobs are generally tradable. They're often high-tech jobs that don't necessarily need to be performed locally. Often SMEs are family businesses versus IDEs can have more diverse ownership structures, equity structures, often needing to bring in external capital providers. And as you can see in the graphic, they have different growth trajectories. So SMEs generally grow at a linear rate, where it's pretty easy to see you put money into the company and the revenues and jobs and cash flows, et cetera, will respond linearly and ideally in a slow but upward fashion. Now, this is a big generalization, but in general, this is the growth trend that SMEs will follow. Whereas with IDEs, you will often see what you hear referred to as the hockey stick curve, right? The company generally starts by losing a lot of money, and we see this in the news all the time with startups and young firms. But if it's successful, it begins to move into this exponential growth curve. This requires investment, but when you put money into the company, it doesn't always necessarily respond in that quick and linear way that SMEs more typically do, but responds more exponentially, but over time. Okay, so just to summarize, entrepreneurship can come in many different forms, from small businesses, so think about restaurants or grocery stores, to high growth or innovation-driven entrepreneurship, so think about your typical Facebook, Uber, Google type firms. We talked about entrepreneurship. So here, think about the person or team at Facebook who maybe developed the like button, or the individual at 3M who innovated the Post-it note. We have social entrepreneurship. Consider, for example, Muhammad Yunus, who was famous for developing the concept of microfinance. And then lifestyle entrepreneurs who might be found on Etsy, or content creators, or that sort of thing. Okay, so we've talked about these different forms of entrepreneurship, and these forms reflect different types of opportunities. So to have entrepreneurship, you have to have entrepreneurial opportunities. And this is probably a word you've heard before, but what does it actually mean? Does this mean you have to provide something new to the world and revolutionary? No, not necessarily. Of course, just offering the same thing to the same market is not likely to go very well for you. Why is that? Because you're not adding value to people's lives. You're not meeting some unmet need. You're not solving anyone's problems that's not already being solved in some way, shape, or form. So we're going to talk about how to focus in and understand on how to do that. But for now, I'm going to just leave it here with the basic insight that an opportunity can stem, for example, from identifying a new market for an existing product or service. Maybe, for example, you've come from a different country and there is something in your country that you think the Canadian market would really love. I remember, for example, spending some time in China and really falling in love with bubble tea. This was a long time ago, and thinking, man, bubble tea would really go over so well in the North American market. And I never did anything with that idea, but sure enough, that idea did certainly come to the North American market. Or it could be a new product or service for an existing market. And sometimes it can also be something that is quite new, i.e. a new product or service for a new market, which would be, let's say, the highest form of innovation, new product, new market. Okay, so now we've also talked a little about the different forms that entrepreneurship can take, the opportunities that drive them. Going back to our definition, it also mentions the individuals that do this activity, the entrepreneurs themselves. So there's been kind of a long-standing research question that tries to understand the traits that would identify or be common across all successful entrepreneurs. Similar to how there's been a lot of research that's tried to identify commonalities across great leaders, the traits that make for really great leadership. And the truth is that we haven't really been able to find the entrepreneurial gene, that one innate characteristic or set of characteristics that are common across all entrepreneurs. So if it's not an innate characteristic, that entrepreneurial gene, what is it that sets great entrepreneurs apart? We're going to talk about that in our next video.